I think what's really interesting, and I've had the privilege of working with Josh and Dave for several years now, and some of the other colleagues that they bring into the mix. And I think as frustrating as it is for some of us who work in and around government and finding that policy and thinking is somewhat fossilized, there are dynamic pockets where it's not. And I think that one of the lessons from Max Manwaring, that you need to think, and I think that is what you see in pockets around the communities, and when those pockets come together, you get really interesting, dynamic, and successful results. There are not nearly as many as there should be, but we're privileged to have here folks who are engaged in that. Joseph asked me to talk a little bit about something that I had mentioned earlier when I was talking about Max, and that is the concept, because people kept telling, when we started on all this transnational organized crime stuff, everybody kept saying, well, what's different? We've always had drug trafficking. We've always had these criminal issues. Colombia has been a violence problem for 50 years. And this is where I embarked on the concept of criminalized states, because it began, as I looked at the Bolivarian structures, looked at what became apparent to me over a period of years I grew up in Bolivia, and I speak Spanish. I was in the region all the time, and I was like, okay, spent 10 years living in El Salvador, and I was like, okay, what are we seeing here? Because I covered the drug wars as a journalist. I was living in Colombia during Pablo Escobar and the Cali cartel, the North Valley cartel, lived through the Salvadoran Civil War, and the Guatemalans and the Hondurans and the Nicaraguans. And so, yes, there were lots of problems, but something seemed to me to have fundamentally changed. And as I began to dive into this and think about it, based in part on my experience in West Africa too, with under Charles Taylor in Liberia and other things, that we had come up with a series of words to describe things in the post 9/11 world that sounded really good, and which I really liked initially, and which ultimately were absolute bullshit. And two of these concepts, one of them was failed states. We love to talk about failed states. I was working in West Africa at the time. Liberia was the top failed state in every index that everybody was putting together. And I thought, yes, what a failed state. They didn't have electricity, they didn't have hospitals, they didn't have roads, they didn't have mail delivery, they didn't have telephone service, they had nothing. But if you looked at it closely, and the more we're diving into this, it was actually an incredibly efficient state, because it was doing efficiently what it wanted to do, which is extracting diamonds, gold, and timber for the benefit of Charles Taylor. They did not care about the Westphalian concept of what a state is providing services. What they were able to do is create a very vibrant, functioning criminal enterprise as a government. And that was sort of a new concept to me. I thought, okay, that's really interesting. And if you look at the Bolivarians, when I came back to Latin America, there is a mixture, I think, of both. There's an ideology left. I think I think it's a mistake to view them as an entirely criminal enterprise, but it is also a united criminal enterprise with joint goals. And what binds them together, I think in the second panel they were talking, somebody was asking what brings these groups together, Iran and Russia, and with the Bolivarians, Venezuela, Bolivia, Ecuador, Nicaragua, and certainly now I would say El Salvador. And if you read their literature, which we spend far too little time doing, and this is one of the things I learned in working with Max, you read what they say, because Marxists and the far left love to tell you what they think. And they will write about it in great detail and explain it to you. And the huge mistake we make is not taking that seriously. So when they began saying, the primary enemy of humanity is the United States, and it is we not only have the right, but the duty to develop weapons of mass destruction to attack them, their allies, Israel and Western Europe. I was like, okay, so now we know why they are together. In their calculation, it was a north-south conflict, not an east-west conflict, that the South had, going back to the days of Daniel Ortega in 1979, in the triumph of the Sandinista Revolution. What did Daniel Ortega say every July 16th in celebrating the victory of the Sandinista Revolution? The Nicaraguan Revolution and the Iranian Revolution are twins, born of the same mother with the same objectives. And at the time when I was living there, that's the stupidest thing I've ever heard. They're not the same at all. But in their fundamental conceptualization of what the world looked like and how they wanted to remake the world, it was true. And so I think that looking at how states, the reason I came up with wanted to differentiate criminalized states from other types of corruption is that most narcos, most criminal organizations that we've looked at over time, 20, 30 years, that's why I'm the old guy up here, is that what do they want? They want a judge who will let them go free. They want a person on the border who will let their dope cross. They want a policeman on the coast who will turn a blind eye. They want a series of specific events or actions to be taken for their benefit and the benefit of their drug trafficking. What the Bolivarians brought into the equation, and they certainly weren't the first ones, was that the state began to look for transnational organized crime as an instrument of foreign policy to further their specific strategic goals. So you no longer had to worry about being caught if you were playing their game, and they were able to use what you produced, cocaine, illicit gold, weapons trafficking, for the benefit of their broader political project as well as your own benefit, because you certainly was not an act of altruism to join these things. But what does that offer you? And this is where I think when Josh was showing the slide of all of what a network actually looks like, how can they get to be that big? And why is it so hard to deal with them? And it comes, I think, to a fundamental misunderstanding that we have in policy circles and as nation states, and it's the way it is. It's not a criticism, it's the way it is, and I don't have a good answer on how to change it. When you're dealing with states that operate as a functioning criminal enterprise, you are dealing with an entirely different ballgame. General Breedlove, when he was commander of NATO, I was at an event with him, and he was talking about Russia, but I think it's applicable here. He said, we always get mad at Russia because we think they're not playing by the rules, right? We think that they're playing soccer, they kick us in the shins, we want the referee to pull out a yellow card or a red card and say, you committed a foul. He said, the problem is they're not playing soccer. They're playing hockey. None of the rules we think apply to them in the construct in which they are operating. They're operating with specific goals, with specific principles. They're completely outside of what we consider to be the norm and rules. So when we yell at people and want to sanction them and say, oh my God, they're not being nice to us, they're not playing it, because they're not on the same soccer field we are. They're off playing basketball or hockey or whatever it is they're playing. And so we have to be able to reconfigure our thinking as in policy circles on how to deal with states that are in a completely fundamentally divided, separate reality, and what they view as legitimate. When Venezuela, when Hugo Chavez and Ahmadinejad began sending containers of cocaine from Venezuela to Iran, what did we think? Oh my God, that's illegal. If two states agree it's legal, it is legal between those two states. It may be outside the norms of what we consider to be decent and legitimate, but in their mind, in their conceptualization, is entirely legitimate how they operate. So I think in understanding what we're seeing in the region, particularly in Latin America now, it's useful to keep in mind that there is, and it's not one state. I grew up in Bolivia, we had in 1980 what they called the cocaine colonels. General Garcia Mesa took over, a drug trafficker, tried to convert Bolivia into the first narco state, and what happened? The United States said no, the neighbors said no. Garcia Mesa collapsed after 9 months. Desi Bouterse, in his first iteration as president of Suriname, the same thing. Drug trafficking, the Dutch said no, it's the former Dutch colony, they cut it off, and he was out of office very short. He's back now, of course, with Chavez, and when Chavez brought him back. But at the time, you could get rid of them. But when you have multiple states operating with a common agenda and able to provide things like what, and this is where it gets to what Josh was talking about, it's so difficult. You have access to passports, diplomatic passports, legitimate diplomatic passports that are then available to whoever wants to buy them. And if you have a diplomatic passport, you can walk through any border across any customs service, and nobody can do anything if your pockets are full of diamonds or gold or illicit gains. You can get access to beautiful things like shipping registries. That's why you see the same ships registered in the same shipping registry, because certain states are willing to rent their shipping registries out or allow them to be used. Aircraft registries, another beautiful thing. A whole series of things that accrue to you if you are in bed in a criminalized state. I think it's important to keep this in mind, because it didn't happen out of nowhere, and it became, and this is why I think the Russian connection, the Iranian connections are so important, because those are state-to-state relationships with states who recognize what the gentleman from Guatemala was talking about as legitimate warfare. If you read the Gerasimov Doctrine, the Russian military now, it's war by any means, pressing different pedals at different times, from cyber to diplomatic to economic to military when necessary. When they come back into the region, when Daniel Ortega is reelected in 2007, and then Sanchez Seren, particularly when he consolidates the FMLN in 2014 in El Salvador, they're talking with people that they've dealt with for the past 40 years who have said publicly, we cannot wait. Jose Luis Merino, they say, we cannot wait. I wish the Soviet Union were here. The Russians show up. They speak Russian. They were trained in the Soviet Union. Boom. They're not plowing new and unfurled grounds. They're going back to their old friendships, as was mentioned. But it's fundamentally difficult in places like the Northern Triangle for the United States to operate when you have countries that are now specifically designing their internal doctrine and their external doctrine to break with the United States in ways that we will be very shocked at seeing. And one of the things when Josh was talking about how things, when all this money that can move, why can they move money the way they can? I'll tell you, it took me a long time to look at this and sort of begin to figure it out. It's actually an incredibly simple process for criminalized states to launder as much money essentially as they want to. Why? Because they realized over time, and you see this particularly in El Salvador and Nicaragua, now where places we're looking at, Suriname, where the state decides that it needs to launder a certain amount of money. In this case that we were looking at particularly on behalf of the FARC and the Sinaloa cartel. So what do? They set up a whole series of companies that don't exist. And simply by declaring it into their budget as stuff that they are doing, then that money is laundered into the system. So for example, in Nicaragua, my favorite case, Hugo Chavez and Daniel Ortega signed this big agreement to build a refinery for Venezuelan oil that will be in Nicaragua called the Sueño Supremo de Bolívar, Bolívar's supreme dream. And it's going to cost a magnificent sum of $4.6 billion. So every time I go to Nicaragua, I go by there, and on paper they have spent about $800 million now on this. It's an empty field with a few rusting oil cans and a sagging fence and one guard there. But every year it appears that on paper that they have invested another $200 or $300 million into that project. It's across the board with their solar panel projects, with almost everything they declare. It doesn't have to happen because no one is going to investigate the state when the state is controlled by a Bolivarian revolution, and they can declare essentially whatever the hell they want, and it becomes then legitimized into the political system. So that's one of the things that we're wrestling with, one of the things that Josh and his folks wrestle with a lot, and what DEA wrestles with a lot, because what we're seeing flowing into Central America, then back into Colombia, are the hundreds of millions, more like billions of dollars, that the FARC was able to bring out of Colombia, take to Central America, where they have their allies, into dollarized economy, push them in, and they do amazing things. The structure in El Salvador, supposedly based on Venezuelan oil that was being imported, which it wasn't. It was FARC money that began flowing in. They were growing enormously every year, even though oil prices fell and no oil was actually arriving. At the end of it, when all the money was essentially laundered through the system they wanted to do, what did they do? And it was brilliant. They declared themselves and their companies in El Salvador to be insolvent. They said, okay, these companies don't exist anymore. We loaned all that money out. We loaned $1.2 billion out. Well, who did they loan it to? To a series of companies they created in Panama that they controlled. So they took in $1.2 billion. They lent themselves $1.13 billion in those 8 companies that we were able to track. And it's a rather remarkable thing. That money's gone. It's flowed through Panama by the time we start looking at it. Nobody in El Salvador can get paid any of their social stuff that they'd accrued for working for these companies. And poof, like magic, is in the system and is virtually untraceable at that point. So that is the kind of problems we're facing in Latin America. And there's certainly other corruption issues. I think it's always important to say that the Bolivarian Revolution did not come out of nowhere, right? You had traditional political parties across the region, Bolivia, Ecuador, certainly Nicaragua, El Salvador, where the political elites had become diminished. They were no longer viewed as viable, legitimate, representing anything other than their own very specific interests, and the Bolivarians were the alternative that was supposed to save them. It didn't, the cure was worse than the disease, but it happened for a reason. People were thinking they were behaving in a politically rational way, and it didn't work out that way. But I think to look at the region now, you have to think and you have to look. And I work for the Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Counter-Narcotics and Global Threats. And one of the things I do constantly, and this is why working with Josh and his people is interesting and fun because they get it, look for stuff that doesn't make sense. Look for large economic activity that is irrational because nobody carries out irrational activity knowingly. So what do you see in Bolivia? Multi-million, tens of millions of dollars spent on an airport in Oruro that has no flights coming in. You see stadiums built in the jungle to house 15,000 people in a village of 400 people. Gee, does that make sense? Probably not. Suriname announces building the largest gold refinery in the hemisphere in conjunction with a major money laundering operation out of the United Arab Emirates. Who the hell is going to send their gold to Suriname? There's no roads, no ports, and no direct flights to anywhere. Why would you do that? Does the refinery exist? No. It exists on paper so that people can move as much gold, real or fictitious, as they want through Suriname. So, but that is what happens when you have a state that's directly participating, because no one's going to go after it. So I'll leave it there and turn it over, but I think that if the magnitude of a multi-state criminal enterprise is new and challenging in ways that we as a government and I think across the globe, we have no mechanisms for dealing with that. We have no mechanisms of separating out those, calling those out from the herd and saying, we're not going to deal with them, or we're not going to recognize them, we can't take their passports, etc. We just don't have that way of doing things. And we better figure out something that will allow us to take a different tack with different types of legitimacies that are out there competing on the global stage for us to get our act together and be able to really go after the networks in ways to be effective.